Welcome to SEVA VentRounds. Today, June 11, 2024. And the topic today is training the mind to see. And this is basically the areas band waveform analysis. Disclosures, there's no endorsements of any mode, manufacturer, or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. You can see Rob on the video and myself. We're both your hosts for the SEVA VentRounds. These are recorded sessions, so just keep your microphone muted. The moderator may call upon you to give a comment, or if you want to make a comment, unmute yourself. Interact with us. You can also put comments on the chat. We're happy to interact and answer and learn together. There's CRCs for any respiratory therapist. So if you're a respiratory therapist, put your name on the chat so we know who you are, and then you will receive credit and just complete that thing. So I decided we were going to jump straight into it. This is fresh out of the oven. This is a patient that I was walking today and I saw, and then I'll give you some of the background, but I think that we should take a look at the image and go from there. So here it is. And I'm going to pause, if you're watching this in a video later on, just pause it here. But in general, I'm going to ask the team, just take a look at this and start going down the list of what you think is going on. What's the tag? What's the load? And the PV discordance. And so just watch it for a second. Go in order. So let's start with the tag. If anybody wants to put the tag on the chat, that's great. Good. So starting to come in. So, I mean, I put the whole screen so that there was no hidden agenda or anything like that, but you can rapidly see PC, CMB, S, and that comes with controlling the pressure during the breath. All right. And we can see the flow waveform is passive. It's different in all of them. The inspiratory time is set by us, and actually you can see it down here. There's the inspiratory time. And the targeting scheme is set point. And we know that from analysis of this mode before, but essentially you set the pressure control, the respiratory rate, and the inspiratory time. So that's the tag. Rob, any comments on the tag?
Nope.
All right. The next question for you all is, what is the load? Is it elastic during inspiration or resistive, or you see evidence of PMOS? Okay. And our teams are rapidly recognizing that this looks highly like elastic. If you look at the return to baseline, it's relatively fast, both in inspiration and expiration. Although each one of these dials is 1 second, you can see that it essentially returns back to baseline in around 1.5 seconds. So I think that I would agree that this is elastic. Rob?
Yep, elastic or approaching normal.
Yeah. So what about the trigger? Is it normal, early, late, false, or failed? Yeah. So I have a couple of people talking about the presence of false on the second breath, and they recognize the presence. So I would ask to the what make you think that this is a false trigger? Because it's not only what the trigger is set at, right? That's that the trigger can be set. Yeah, there you go, Annika. So Annika says, well, I see some cardiac oscillations, and none of the other breaths are triggered. Good. That's one of the markers. Okay, what else? Yeah, so you guys are recognizing the cardiac oscillation. So these little blips over here. Good. So that's a good eye. What else? Well, the capnogram doesn't show much. Right now, it looks basically flat. It's not the classic one for cardiac oscillations, at least on this graph. What else tells you that there is that this may be a false trigger? Any other marker? Good, Saint. So you're right. It doesn't seem, at least on this scale, that there is any dip on the pressure waveform that tells you that there's a trigger. So you're looking for evidence of PMOS, right? What is there any other evidence of PMOS here? No. So it's actually an exponential decay, a beautiful exponential decay with no evidence of PMOS. So that tells you why I cannot see any PMOS in there, right? So that should raise your alerts that this is a false trigger. So you're absolutely correct. Now, let me ask you again the question: do you see any evidence of PMOS? And pay attention carefully to the waveform. Now you know that there's a false trigger, correct? You saw a false trigger. That's a false trigger. The others are triggers. Is there any evidence of PMOS? Anything that would make you suspect that there is any PMOS here? It's very subtle. It's very subtle, but it's there. So I want you to take a look carefully at the waveforms. And so yes, Roberto, high quality. So if we see the waveforms, look at the flow waveform, and remember that the exponential decay is dependent on three things: the elastance, the resistance, and the presence of PMOS. And obviously other artifacts can also modify it. But you can see this one has a little bit of a bumpy here. This one falls the same. So you could say, well, maybe that's a cardiac oscillation. But then look at the next one. You see this sucker over here? How much it raises compared to the other one? And this one falls very nicely. So that should raise some concern. But then Rob pointed out, look at the expiratory phase here. You see that? So the expiratory phase, if you look at it, it tries to go up, and look what happens to the volume. So the volume waveform amplifies what you see on the flow waveform. So sometimes when I cannot see on the flow waveform, my eyes travel to the flow because it amplifies what is happening there. So I see this plateau here, and then I come down and see my end-tidal CO2 and forcing myself. But now instead of plateauing as it should, I see a little dip occurring there, and perhaps a little dip occurring here, which tells me that that patient may be having some inspiratory effort during exhalation. Rob?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. So now that you have seen this, now you cannot unsee it, right? So now your eyes have, your mind is trained now to take a look at this. Now I'm going to show you. So you recognize appropriately a false trigger, and that's what stopped me as I was walking, because I usually, when you're on pressure control, having some constant tidal volumes is something that it raises my awareness that the patient may be over assisted. That's a concern of mine now. So the first intervention that you do if you suspect false trigger is to do a expiratory hold, and that's what I did. And this is the expiratory hold on this patient. And I want you to notice, do you see any PMOS? Nothing highly evident, correct? I mean, if there's a pause, so you don't see any flow occurring, but you will see a little bit of oscillation on the pressure waveform, very subtle. That when I saw that, I said, this patient is not triggering. So this is definitely false triggering. But when you see the waveform from the entitled CO2, which amplifies what we see here, you see a little bit of that oscillation again. You see that over here, which makes me think that the patient may be doing some gentle inspiratory effort. Not major, slow and big. And not big, slow and mild. Rob?
Yeah, that's the way I would interpret it. It's one of those things that you'd have to like put your hands on the patient to see if you could feel their abdomen doing something.
Exactly. So I said, well, this doesn't. So is there any PMOS or not? So so I just wanted to show this patient had been an issue overnight with multiple problems with the ventilator and with synchrony and double stacking, double triggering. And so this is the graph that I chose for you to see because it has that subtle PMOS and the false triggering. But then you can see this is actually what I saw when I was walking by. And you can see the breath, a breath, and then this one over here, correct? So now that you see this one, you already recognize, because you know that the breath number 1, breath number 2, this is breath number 3 and 4 together. This is breath number 5 and breath number 6. And breath number 1 and 2 and 6 are false triggers. You can see that very nicely, right? So these are false triggers. So 1, 2, and 6 are false triggers. What about 3 and 4? What's the problem in that one? So what you're seeing here is the breath seems to be patient trigger and actually generates much more flow than the prior one. So I do think that there was PMOS there. Actually, you can see that as the patient does, yes. So as you see, there's much more flow at the beginning of the breath, right? And then it triggers the next breath because of an early cycle. So this is if it had been, and I have another example in which that it looked like a false trigger and then with reverse trigger. So I think that Ariel, you're right on that one. But the abnormal thing is the amount of flow that it's at the beginning. So that makes me think that the patient actually did do a breath there. But that certainly could be. But I think that this is breath 3 and 4. It causes this because of an early cycle. Rob?
Yeah, I think the key there is what you pointed out is that the inspiratory flow is much higher than all the other breaths. And the only way that can happen is not through cardiac oscillations, but through PMOS.
Yeah. And then so, but could this be an early a false trigger causing an early trigger? It could be. I mean, it would be very close to the trigger, so I cannot recognize it just by what I'm seeing here. I do want to show you because I thought that this was kind of cool. We sometimes think about this as when a patient double triggers and gets much more tidal volume, you see that it takes longer for the breath to return to baseline. And because of that, it's kind of protective And now the ventilator triggers a breath. So this is a mandatory breath that gets triggered. So the patient got so much sterile volume, you can see it got close to 1200 plus this one, so around 1500 cc's, and then exhales. And actually, so if you imagine the curve for exhalation goes all the way over here, and then the patient, it resets, and then there gets another breath, which is mandatory. So very, very nice, right? So yes, you're right saying. So the pressure, so this pressure waveform is also below the other one, which may signify that the ventilator could not pressurize to the level that it should because of the breath. So now I want to show you this one because this one is more consistent. Ariel had said that the entitled CO2 looked like cardiac oscillations. Now you can actually see the cardiac oscillations much better, right? They become very evident. I changed the gain so that I could see the pressure, the flow oscillations, and now you can see clearly the flow oscillations from the cardiac, the heart. So this is the heart going tung, 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 tung. And that's because I changed the patient to -2. This was intentionally done so that I could see and change the flow waveform. So now you can see here the patient did trigger a breath. So there's evidence of PMOS right here. It drops the pressure, the flow goes up, triggers a breath, then the patient exhales. And then you see how the flow tries to go up and then down in average. And you can see that little plateau that generates on the flow, which talks to me about PMOS, the presence of PMOS inspiratory, very mild, but it exists. So it triggers one and perhaps, and then it has another little one there. So the key for this one is for you to see this. But now that I have shown you this flow, sometimes when you have all these oscillations, it's hard to see. So I show you that you can see it as an amplification on your volume, but also if you go down and see the CO2, you see how the CO2 now looks like an inspiration during the exhalation. It goes all the way to 0, which is fresh gas going through the sensor. And so this one over here is what type of trigger? Yeah, good job saying a failed trigger. Good. And the way to diagnose it, I mean, you can see if you came and only saw this waveform, I could not see it. I don't know you, Rob, but it would be, I would have to be Hawkeye looking at this thing. This one, the flow shows it better, so that's highly suspicious. The volume, highly suspicious, but the entitled CO2 confirmatory of a failed trigger. It's a very mild effort, but it's there. And that happened because I put the trigger at -2. And so, because I was trying to get rid of the false triggers, right? So then, well, the curare cleft is different. And we can talk about that in a second, Ariel. But now I'm going to show you. So this is in 2 centimeters of water. And now watch the waveform. And this becomes even more evident to what we saw before. So this is kind of confirmatory to our analysis before. So I want you, that's why this is the case that keeps on giving. So we recognize, right, that this is inhalation. So I'm going to follow it back. Just follow my line. I'm trying to be as straight as I can. So you see how the pressure dropped? And it goes with the inhalation that you see in the entitled CO2. You can kind of see it, but because now I have normalized the flow gain, it's in auto gain, you cannot see it, but the patient effort started here. So what type of trigger is this one? What's the problem with this one? Yes, Miguel, this is a late trigger. Exactly. So now it's a late trigger. Now come over here, and again, You cannot see anything here. You can barely see it on the flow. You can see that little plateau on the volume, but you come down here and you can see that there is again a failed trigger. And here's another one. So now that I had that ability, exactly, without the capnography, I could not have seen this. And now you remember that we were wondering if that was PMOS. Now you can see very clearly that this effort that we had over here with higher flow is definitely a early cycle. So now in this image, you have a late trigger, 2 failed triggers, and a very large breath, an early cycle.
Eduardo,
Yes, sir.
I can't tell. Does that first breath have white on the pressure waveform to
Nope.
indicate a patient trigger?
Nope.
Well, then why would you call it a late trigger?
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you remember we had
Patient
this
didn't trigger,
conversation?
so it can't be
We
late.
had this conversation last week.
Okay.
Oh, not last week, 2 weeks ago, in which there was a breath that was synchronous by just luck.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
And you told me, Eduardo, it fell at the same time. It's synchronous, so let it go. But you're right. I mean, this is how you would classify it. But absolutely, you're actually absolutely. So this would be like the way that I solved that in our last conversation is I would call it late trigger with an asterisk.
Well, if we're going to say that,
Yeah, you're right.
it looks like the patient signal is missing because there's no evidence of the patient signal in the trigger of pressure or a trigger of flow. Now you see a signal in tidal CO2, but that's not a trigger signal. So
no, it didn't trigger. So then I changed the patient to 1 of trigger, and I still had the same problem. You can see that. I mean, the patient still is doing effort, very mild, but enough to create inhalation, and sometimes the breath is machine trigger. There's an attempt to fail here. You can see that little thing that I demonstrated before. So what's the solution for this patient? How would we solve? So I have tried every single type of trigger, and it causes more problems than solutions, right? So I showed you the trigger and what the patient was. Then I went to a negative -2, and I caused failed triggers, a bunch of them. And then I caused complete desynchrony, right? There's no concordance in this. One is going on their own, the other one is going on their own. Then I went down, and now I still have the problem. So how can we solve this?
and the rate's already pretty low, right?
Yeah, well, I went down on the rate because I wanted to show the abnormalities and see if I would catch the patient.
Right.
I love the question from Zane. He says, if the end tidal is more sensitive, why can't we make it a trigger parameter? Yeah, so assume the goal is comfort, Ariel. Yeah, Anika, NAVA is a potential. If your goal is safety, so NAVA would be a good option because then you're bypassing the airway signal, right? That would be the key item here is that we would switch this patient to a mode in which we use the signal from the airway, from the diaphragm to control those breaths. What about if the goal is safety?
Well, if the goal is safety, are we violating any safety rules?
Right. Well, there's some Yeah, as you saw, there's the high risk PVI.
Okay, yeah, okay. There you
There's
go.
a number of failed triggers that are occurring.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so it's very challenging, right? So you
Mm.
realize, so either you sedate and paralyze, but this diaphragm is very weak, or you tolerate and choose a mode that causes the least harm for this patient and keeps them within uh, an appropriate level. Just to give context there, in this case, the goal was irrelevant because the patient, unfortunately, there was nothing much to do at that point, and we moved to comfort. But the point is, when I saw this is, if your goal is comfort and synchrony, then you have to go to NAVA, and if not, you have to move towards a mode that will allow and will make the early cycle less problematic, and so that's where the team ended. So really a good case to discuss. It's a crazy case with many stuff at the same time, and I think that it highlights how sometimes the technology would not be able to solve problems easily. So if this patient had an outcome that we needed to deal with, I would have wanted that patient to have a higher respiratory rate, a higher effort. So I agree with what Ariel is saying. Well, reduce the respiratory rate and see if the patient is perhaps over assisted and give them more of the rhythm so that they can trigger appropriately the ventilator, right? So I think that that's spot on. But if the patient was on this circumstance and we could not achieve it, uh, perhaps NAVA is an alternative for triggering better, and it will also prevent some of the over assistance issues. Here are the CME and CCF. There's the Twitter, our emails if you want to send us questions, images, and whatnot. A lot of resources, and this will be episode number 73 of SEVA VentRounds. Thank you for